In the fall of 1982, the Miller family of 4 disappeared without a trace from their home in the secluded town of Blackwood, nestled in the remote valleys of West Virginia. Their vanishing would have remained just another cold case in the records of the county sheriff's department if not for what investigators uncovered 4 months later, a concealed chamber beneath the foundation of the old stone chapel, containing the Millers' personal effects alongside meticulously kept diary entries describing rites that the mainstream Protestant church had denounced generations ago. The most baffling detail was that the final journal entry was dated 3 weeks after the family was last seen. For over 40 years, the chapel elders have refused to acknowledge the discovery, and the Miller house stands empty and decaying to this day. What makes this incident even more alarming is that when authorities finally accessed sealed chapel archives in 2002, they learned that the Miller family was not the first to vanish under these inexplicable circumstances. Tonight, I will unveil the true events that transpired in that quiet Appalachian town, based on documents that have never been released to the public, including the testimony of the sole surviving witness who has, at last, agreed to break 30 years of silence. Before we delve deeper into the saga of the Miller family and their ties to the old stone chapel, be warned, this channel isn't for the faint of heart. It is only for the most courageous spirits who dare to unearth the darkest enigmas that others refuse to reveal. If you are one of those genuine seekers of mystery, subscribe now and let me know in the comments which country you're listening from. Very few platforms dare to share the kinds of narratives we explore here, stories that the powers that be attempted to erase forever. Now, let us step back into the gloom of 1982 West Virginia and uncover the horror that lay in wait in the town of Blackwood. The events that unfolded in that small Appalachian settlement would shatter everything the inhabitants believed about their peaceful, devout community and expose a conspiracy of secrecy that had guarded unspeakable truths for nearly half a century. Blackwood was the kind of town where time appeared to flow at its own pace, where ancient timber and stone houses held memories of 2 centuries of continuous life. Tucked deep within the Appalachian foothills, encircled by forested mountains that blazed with fiery oak and maple each autumn, it was home to scarcely 400 souls, most of whom could trace their lineages back 4 or 5 generations within the same cluster of family homes. The town centered around the old stone chapel, a formidable Gothic revival structure that commanded the landscape with its moss-covered sandstone spire piercing the West Virginia sky. The chapel had been constructed in 1892 on the grounds of an even older pioneer meeting house, and local legend held that the site had been regarded as hallowed long before organized religion reached the hills. The heavy wooden doors, fortified with iron fittings that had oxidized to a deep rust, groaned eerily in the wind that perpetually swept down from the ridges. The autumn of 1982 brought an unseasonable cold to West Virginia that seemed to seep into the very marrow of the town. The foliage changed color sooner than anyone could recall, staining the mountainsides in vivid scarlets and ambers that looked almost supernatural in their brilliance. A lingering mist began settling over the hollow each nightfall, clinging to the time-worn stones of the old stone chapel like a sentient being. The fog was so dense that many townsfolk reported feeling lost when walking through the chapel grounds at twilight, as if the well-known trails had mysteriously reconfigured themselves in the haze. The chapel bell, which had tolled faithfully for more than a century to mark the hours and summon the congregation, began to sound different that fall. Miss Agatha Bell, who had resided beside the chapel for 58 years, was the first to notice. The iron bell seemed to produce a lower, more mournful tone than she remembered, as if the very atmosphere had grown dense around it. Occasionally, deep in the night, she would vow she heard the bell ringing when it should have been silent, soft, sorrowful chimes that seemed to emanate from below the earth rather than the spire above. David Michael Miller was a man whose life operated with metronomic regularity. At 42 years old, he had inherited both his meticulous disposition and his role at the town's general store from his father. Each morning at exactly 7:15, David would emerge from his house on Chapel Street, dressed in his neatly ironed work clothes and carrying his weathered leather bag. He would walk his two children, Catherine Marie, aged 13, and young James David, aged 9, to the town's elementary school before continuing to his job, managing supplies and the postal counter for the entire valley. David was a reserved man who kept his own counsel, but those close to him described him as deeply faithful in the traditional Appalachian way, pious but not ostentatious, believing but pragmatic. He served as a deacon at the old stone chapel and could be found every Sunday morning making sure the hymn books were in order and the donation plates were polished. His belief was as constant and dependable as the Appalachian Mountains themselves, which made his eventual fate even more unfathomable to those who knew him. Elizabeth and Miller, née Croft, had come to Blackwood as a young bride 17 years prior. At 39, she maintained the striking elegance that had first captured David's attention at a church picnic in a neighboring county. Her auburn hair, which she wore in a simple style befitting a town mother, still caught the light in a way that made her seem younger. Elizabeth managed their modest house with the same systematic exactness that defined the entire Miller family. But there was a more inquisitive quality to her spirit, a fascination with the world that sometimes clashed with the conventional norms of town life. Elizabeth had always been captivated by regional history and folklore, passing hours in the town's reading room, studying the archaic practices of the Appalachian region. She kept a garden abundant with herbs and native flowers that many of the older residents recognized as plants their own grandparents had cultivated for purposes no longer spoken of in polite society. When asked about her unusual botanical pursuits, Elizabeth would smile and mention that she liked preserving the old ways, though she was never explicit about which ways she meant. The Miller children were the pride of their school. Catherine Marie was a solemn, contemplative girl who thrived in her classes and assisted her mother with domestic tasks without protest. She had inherited her mother's auburn hair and her father's steadfast nature, though her teachers observed that she sometimes seemed more mature than her 13 years, as if she bore knowledge that pressed heavily upon her. Catherine loved to read, especially books about history and legend, and she could often be found in the chapel cemetery transcribing epitaphs from the most aged markers into a journal she kept with her always. James David, known to all as Jamie, was the town's acknowledged delight. At 9 years old, he possessed a contagious grin and an inquisitiveness about everything around him that endeared him to every adult in Blackwood. He was particularly captivated by the chapel, spending afternoons studying the carved wooden corbels that adorned the eaves and asking incessant questions about the biblical scenes in the simple glass windows. Jamie had a tendency to draw constantly, filling sketchbook after sketchbook with images of the chapel, the surrounding woodlands, and, as the autumn advanced, increasingly unsettling pictures that his teacher found difficult to comprehend. The town of Blackwood functioned according to rhythms established generations earlier. The farmers' market was still held every Friday in the small commons next to the chapel, though the vendors now arrived by truck rather than wagon. The tavern, the Hunter's Lodge, served as the unofficial community center where news was exchanged and consensus was formed. The general store doubled as the post office, and the town school educated children from ages 5 to 15 before they were bused to the larger town of Millworth for high school. But beneath this facade of rustic serenity, Blackwood concealed secrets that stretched back generations. The town had always been remote, not just in geography, but in culture. The founding families, the Crofts, the Evans, the Blackburns, and a few others, maintained customs and rituals that outsiders almost never witnessed. These families intermarried frequently and shared wisdom that was transmitted through carefully selected lineages. Miss Eleanor Blackburn, the town archivist and unofficial guardian of local lore, was a scion of one of Blackwood's original families. Her cottage housed books and manuscripts accumulated over generations, including texts that the church had attempted to quash during various periods of religious revival. Miss Blackburn was a petite, sparrow-like woman in her late 70s who spoke in hushed tones and appeared to know everyone's affairs before they did. She had never married, devoting her life instead to what she termed safeguarding our legacy. Dr. Richard Evans, the town doctor, was another member of the founding families. At 58, he had returned to Blackwood after medical training in Baltimore, bringing with him modern science that he somehow integrated with older curative traditions passed down from his grandfather. Dr. Evans kept meticulous files not just on his patients' physical health, but on what he referred to as their spiritual equilibrium, though he was always ambiguous about what this entailed. The county deputy, Sergeant Frank Walsh, was one of the few authority figures in Blackwood not linked to the founding families. He had been stationed in the town 6 years earlier and had slowly become aware that there were dimensions of town life that remained veiled from him. Walsh was a diligent, systematic man who took pride in comprehending his jurisdiction fully, and his failure to access certain facets of Blackwood's social fabric had become a growing source of vexation. Reverend John Croft had ministered at the Old Stone Chapel for 26 years, arriving in Blackwood as a young assistant pastor, newly graduated from seminary. Over the years, he had morphed from a vigorous proponent of religious renewal into something far more intricate and disquieting. His office, situated in the parsonage adjacent to the chapel, was crammed with antiquated manuscripts, archaeological relics, and volumes on topics that seemed to have little relation to standard Protestant doctrine. Reverend Croft was a lanky, slender man with prematurely silvered hair and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. His sermons had grown progressively more abstruse over time, laden with allusions to elder verities and profounder enigmas that left many congregants bewildered and anxious. Yet he remained well-liked among certain members of the flock, particularly those from the founding families who seemed to comprehend references that eluded everyone else. In the weeks preceding their disappearance, several Blackwood residents observed shifts in the miller's conduct. The changes were subtle initially, Elizabeth spending more time in the chapel cemetery, David seeming preoccupied and troubled, the children growing more reserved. But as November progressed, these alterations became impossible to disregard. Miss Agatha Bell, whose property bordered the Millers, was the first to notice Elizabeth's nighttime activities. Starting in early November, Elizabeth had begun spending long hours in the Old Stone Chapel's cemetery after nightfall, often carrying what looked like bundles of herbs, blossoms, and other objects Miss Bell couldn't identify in the moonlight. When she mustered the nerve to ask Elizabeth about these late-night walks, the younger woman simply smiled and replied, "I'm maintaining the old customs, Miss Bell. Someone must perform the proper rites." The phrase, proper rites, meant nothing to Miss Bell, but it left her with a disquiet she couldn't dismiss. Elizabeth's tone had been amiable enough, but there was something in her gaze that hinted at depths of understanding that unsettled the older woman. Miss Bell began keeping her drapes closed after dark and finding reasons to avoid chats with her neighbor. Mr. Henry Moss, who operated the town's general store, noted significant changes in Elizabeth's buying patterns during November. She had always been a prudent shopper, purchasing only what her household required and keeping strict budgets. But suddenly, she was buying large amounts of peculiar items, bags of rock salt, bundles of white taper candles, and what she described as specific botanicals from old Mrs. Green, the town's unofficial herbalist who grew healing and culinary plants in her expansive cottage plot. When Mr. Moss remarked on these unusual acquisitions, Elizabeth clarified that she was getting ready for the Thanksgiving season. Though this justification made little sense, given that the Millers had never kept more than a small kitchen plot, the items she was purchasing seemed better suited to some ceremonial function than any practical domestic need. But Mr. Moss was too courteous to inquire further. The town schoolteacher, Miss Laura Simmons, grew increasingly worried about the conduct of the Miller children during November. Catherine, typically a stellar pupil, became inattentive and withdrawn. She was often caught gazing out the classroom window toward the old stone chapel, and when called upon, she would answer as if waking from a daydream. Her compositions, once exemplars of clear logic and correct syntax, became filled with references to archaic wisdom and neglected truths that seemed far too advanced for a 13-year-old. Young Jamie's behavior was even more alarming. The normally buoyant and chatty boy had become fixated on sketching, using every spare moment to create the same troubling picture repeatedly. The drawing depicted hooded figures encircling what looked like an altar marked with symbols Miss Simmons didn't recognize, but that somehow made her deeply uneasy. When she asked Jamie to explain his artwork, he would only say, "I'm drawing what Mom and Reverend Croft taught me about the old chapel." Miss Simmons tried to discuss her concerns with David during a parent meeting in mid-November, but found him avoidant and visibly distressed. David conceded that Elizabeth had become engaged in what he termed historical studies, with Reverend Croft and a few other town residents, but maintained it was merely scholarly inquiry. However, his demeanor suggested he was far from comfortable with whatever was transpiring in his home. The organization that would later be exposed as the core of Blackwood's dark secrets had begun innocently enough in 1979. Reverend Croft had proposed forming a club to examine the historical traditions of the Appalachian region, with special focus on the folk customs that had influenced local culture for centuries. The group originally comprised 5 members: Reverend Croft himself, Miss Eleanor Blackburn, Dr. Richard Evans, Mrs. Abigail Green, the herbalist, and Mr. Charles Miller, a retired professor who had relocated to Blackwood from Richmond. The club gathered monthly in the chapel's side room, ostensibly to review historical papers and folk evidence pertaining to ancient Appalachian traditions. They called themselves the Blackwood Heritage Society and claimed to be compiling a comprehensive study of regional folklore that would eventually be published for posterity. Elizabeth Miller joined the group in the summer of 1980, attracted by her long-standing curiosity about local history and encouraged by Reverend Croft, who had noted her extensive reading on folk customs. Elizabeth proved to be a zealous and committed member, contributing research on plant-based remedies and seasonal festivals that impressed the other participants with its thoroughness and genuineness. What the public didn't know was that the Heritage Society's endeavors had slowly evolved far beyond academic study. By 1980, the group had commenced what they termed practical applications of ancient rituals, initially rationalizing these activities as essential for grasping the historical contexts they were examining. These applications started simply enough: seasonal festivals based on agricultural cycles, herbal preparation methods used for generations, and meditation techniques they asserted were derived from pioneer spiritual traditions. However, under Reverend Croft's direction, these practices had become progressively more complex and disturbing. The pastor had persuaded the group that true comprehension of archaic traditions demanded not just intellectual pursuit, but experiential involvement. He contended that mainstream religion had suppressed valuable spiritual insights and that reclaiming these traditions was not just academically significant but spiritually vital. By the time Elizabeth joined, the group was meeting twice monthly, with extra special observances scheduled around what they called significant dates in the elder calendar. These observances occurred in a room below the old stone chapel that Reverend Croft claimed to have found during repair work. The chamber, he explained, had been utilized for sacred purposes long before the current chapel was erected and represented a direct link to the spiritual customs of their forebears. Elizabeth's passion for the group's work impressed all the members, but it was her proposal that families should partake together in certain ceremonies that marked a pivotal moment in the organization's evolution. She argued that many ancient traditions were specifically fashioned around family units and that partial involvement might actually be hazardous, potentially leaving rituals incomplete in ways that could have adverse effects. David Miller had initially been doubtful of his wife's participation in the Heritage Society, but Elizabeth's evident enthusiasm and intellectual engagement had slowly won him over. She would return from gatherings filled with excitement about new findings and perspectives, sharing tales about Appalachia's concealed history that fascinated even David's pragmatic mind. When Elizabeth proposed that he might appreciate attending some of the group's presentations, David agreed to visit one of their regular meetings. The meeting David attended in August 1980 seemed benign. Reverend Croft had prepared a talk about pioneer farming methods, complete with historical records and artifacts he had borrowed from various local collections. The other members were clearly erudite and ardent about their research, and David found himself genuinely interested in learning about the agricultural techniques his own ancestors might have employed generations earlier. However, as months passed and Elizabeth became more deeply involved with the group's activities, David began to notice troubling changes in his wife's behavior and attitudes. She started speaking critically of contemporary religious practices, suggesting that modern faith had lost crucial spiritual understanding that ancient traditions preserved. She began keeping strange hours, staying up late to study obscure texts Reverend Croft had given her, and rising before dawn to tend to plants and preparations that seemed to have no utilitarian purpose. Most distressing to David was Elizabeth's growing insistence that the children should be educated about the elder paths. She began teaching Catherine and Jamie about herbal medicine, seasonal festivals, and what she termed proper reverence for the forces that shape our world. The children seemed to enjoy these lessons at first, but David noticed they were becoming secretive about what they learned, sharing private jokes and allusions he didn't comprehend. In October 1982, David decided to speak directly with Reverend Croft about his apprehensions. He arranged a private meeting in the pastor's office, intending to discuss Elizabeth's escalating obsession with the historical group and its impact on their family life. What he discovered during that conversation would torment him for the few remaining weeks of his life. Reverend Croft received David in his office, a room that had always seemed disorderly with books and papers, but now appeared almost overwhelming in its density of strange relics and unfamiliar volumes. The pastor listened patiently as David outlined his worries, nodding sympathetically and asking perceptive questions about specific instances of Elizabeth's altered conduct. But when David finished speaking, Reverend Croft's response was not what he had anticipated. Instead of offering consolation or proposing ways to moderate Elizabeth's involvement with the group, the pastor launched into an explanation of why the family's participation in the Heritage Society's work was not just advantageous but imperative. He spoke of spiritual duties that transcended individual preferences, of ancient responsibilities that certain families were destined to fulfill, and of the perilous consequences of abandoning traditions that had safeguarded the community for generations. David left that meeting more bewildered and concerned than ever. Reverend Croft's words had carried an undertone of menace that David couldn't quite pinpoint, but definitely felt. The pastor had made it clear that the Miller family's continued participation in the group's activities was not merely desired, but obligatory, though he had never explicitly stated what might occur if they chose to withdraw. November 1982 brought an escalation of strange occurrences in Blackwood that seemed to revolve around the Miller family. Elizabeth's activities became more intensive and clandestine, with multiple weekly trips to the chapel and constant preparation of materials whose purpose she would not explain to her increasingly anxious husband. The children's behavior grew more unpredictable, with both Catherine and Jamie displaying knowledge and employing vocabulary that seemed far beyond their years. Dr. Richard Evans would later testify that David visited his practice 3 times during November, showing symptoms of severe anxiety and what the doctor described as acute nervous exhaustion. David complained of sleeplessness, loss of appetite, and what he called a feeling of impending catastrophe that he couldn't shake. When Dr. Evans pressed him for details about the source of his distress, David would only say that Elizabeth had become involved in activities that he feared were perilous for the entire family. During his final visit to Dr. Evans's office on November 24, David appeared to be on the brink of a complete collapse. He spoke rapidly and incoherently about ancient duties and ceremonies that can't be halted once initiated. He asked Dr. Evans about the symptoms of what he termed religious frenzy, and whether there were medical treatments for people who had become convinced they were receiving supernatural messages. Most disturbing, David asked Dr. Evans whether he believed it was possible for primal malevolence to endure in locations where dreadful events had happened in the past. When the doctor asked what had prompted this question, David replied that Elizabeth had been spending time in sections of the chapel that he was sure had never been accessible to the public before, and that she claimed to be receiving direction from sources that existed beyond the ordinary world. Dr. Evans recommended that David speak with Reverend Croft about his spiritual concerns, advice he would regret for the remainder of his life. What Dr. Evans didn't know was that the pastor was not a source of aid for the Miller family, but the principal designer of their ruin. The final week of November brought dramatic changes to the Miller household that were noted by everyone acquainted with the family. Elizabeth stopped attending her usual social commitments and was seldom seen outside her home except for journeys to the chapel. The children ceased playing with their friends and appeared increasingly pallid and detached. David missed several days of work, something that had never happened in his 17 years at the general store. Miss Bell later recalled hearing noises from the Miller house that she couldn't identify, rhythmic incantations, the burning of substances that produced unusually pungent smoke, and conversations conducted in voices so hushed she couldn't discern words, but could detect an emotional intensity that made her progressively uncomfortable. On several occasions, she observed unusual visitors arriving at the Miller house after dark, figures in dark clothing who moved with purposeful quiet and never remained longer than an hour. November 30, 1982, was a Tuesday that dawned bleak and frigid, with the persistent mist that had afflicted Blackwood all autumn hanging so thickly that the peak of the old stone chapel spire was entirely hidden. The evening prayer service proceeded normally, with the Miller family occupying their regular pew. However, several congregants later recalled that the family's demeanor during the service had been distinctly odd. Elizabeth sat with an expression of intense focus throughout Reverend Croft's sermon, which centered on the theme of ancient pacts and their endurance through time. She appeared to be taking notes in a small bound notebook, something she had never done during chapel services before. David sat stiffly beside her, his face ashen and his hands clenched. The children were uncommonly silent, sitting perfectly motionless in a way that seemed unnatural for youngsters their age. Reverend Croft's sermon itself was unlike his typical discourses. He spoke of obligations that transcend individual choice and the wisdom of traditions that predate our current understanding. He made several references to tonight's observance and the importance of finishing what has been commenced, phrases that meant nothing to most of the congregation, but clearly held special significance for certain members. After the service, the Miller family was seen walking home together, but their movement seemed somehow different from their usual routine. Instead of the leisurely pace they typically maintained, they walked swiftly and purposefully, as if they had pressing business awaiting them. Miss Bell, who was fetching firewood when they passed, later recalled that none of them acknowledged her greeting, something that was completely out of character for the normally courteous family. The last confirmed sighting of the complete Miller family was at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon when Mr. Moss observed them entering their house and closing the door firmly behind them. What happened next would only be pieced together months later from evidence discovered in the hidden chambers beneath the old stone chapel. Miss Bell noticed that the lights in the Miller house were extinguished earlier than usual that evening. By 7:30, the house was completely dark, something that had never happened before on a weeknight, when the family traditionally spent the evening together. When she peered through her curtains at 9:30, she could detect no signs of life in the house at all. But it was sometime after midnight on November 30th that Miss Bell witnessed the event that would haunt her for the rest of her days. She was awakened by sounds that she initially thought were part of a dream. Distant chanting that seemed to ebb and flow with a rhythm that was both mesmerizing and deeply disquieting. When she realized the sounds were real, she moved to her bedroom window to investigate their source. What she saw in the old stone chapel's grounds defied rational explanation. Figures carrying lanterns or torches were moving in what appeared to be a procession around the chapel building. The figures were dressed in dark, hooded robes that obscured their identities, but their movements were deliberate and synchronized, suggesting a ceremony that had been meticulously planned and practiced. The chanting persisted for what felt like hours, rising and falling in intensity, but never ceasing completely. Miss Bell was certain she could hear children's voices among the adult ones, high and clear tones that stood out against the deeper voices of the adult participants. The sound made her feel physically sick, though she couldn't explain why. Most disturbing of all, the procession eventually disappeared. Miss Bell watched as the figures moved toward the chapel building and simply vanished, as if the ancient stone walls had parted to admit them. The lights continued to flicker in the chapel grounds for several more hours, but she never saw the participants emerge. Tuesday morning, December 1st, 1982, began what would become one of the most baffling missing persons investigations in West Virginia history. When David failed to appear at the general store by his usual time of 8 a.m., his employer, Mr. Samuel Jenkins, initially assumed the family was dealing with an illness or other temporary emergency. However, when repeated phone calls to the Miller house went unanswered, Mr. Jenkins decided to investigate personally. He drove to Chapel Street and knocked on the house door, receiving no response. When he peered through the windows, he could see that the interior seemed tidy and undisturbed, but there were no indications of current occupation. The house felt empty in a way that suggested the absence was not temporary. Mr. Jenkins contacted Sergeant Frank Walsh, who arrived at the house within 45 minutes to commence a preliminary investigation. What Walsh found would perplex him for months and eventually lead to discoveries that would rattle the entire community of Blackwood to its core. The house door was unlocked, something that was unusual but not unheard of in a town where most residents trusted one another implicitly. The interior was spotlessly clean and organized, with no signs of a struggle, hurried departure, or violence. The family's personal possessions were in their customary places, Elizabeth's handbag hanging on its usual peg, David's billfold in the dresser drawer where he always kept it, the children's school clothes laid out for Tuesday morning. In the kitchen, Walsh found evidence that the family had prepared and eaten supper. The dishes had been washed and stored, and there were no signs that a meal had been interrupted. However, he did notice that certain items seemed to be missing from their usual spots: the candles Miss Bell had mentioned seeing in the house, several volumes from Elizabeth's collection of folklore texts, and what appeared to be some of the herbal mixtures she had been working on in recent weeks. Most puzzling was the discovery in David's small home office. On his desk lay an open Bible turned to the Book of Revelation, chapter 16, which deals with the bowls of God's wrath. Written in the margin in what appeared to be Elizabeth's handwriting was a single line: "The elder pact must be honored, whatever the cost." Below it, in David's more angular script, were the words, "Lord save us. I fear we are in too deep to escape now." Sergeant Walsh spent the entire day conducting interviews with every resident of Blackwood who might have information about the family's disappearance. The picture that emerged from these discussions was troubling and contradictory. While everyone agreed the Miller family had been acting strangely in recent weeks, no one could provide specific information about where they might have gone or why they would have left without telling anyone. Walsh's investigation quickly revealed that several key members of the community were being less than truthful about their knowledge of the family's activities. Reverend Croft, when questioned about the Heritage Society, acknowledged that Elizabeth had been an active member but insisted the group's activities were purely academic and couldn't possibly be connected to the disappearance. However, when Walsh pressed for details about the group's recent meetings, the pastor became evasive and defensive. Croft claimed the society's records were private and that revealing their content would violate the trust of other members. He suggested the family had probably decided to take a spontaneous trip and would likely return shortly. Dr. Evans was even less helpful, claiming patient confidentiality prevented him from discussing his recent conversations with David. When Walsh pointed out that missing persons investigations superseded normal confidentiality rules, Dr. Evans reluctantly admitted David had been suffering from anxiety related to family pressures but refused to elaborate on their specific nature. Miss Eleanor Blackburn, the archivist, proved to be the most forthcoming of the Heritage Society members, though her information was more disturbing than helpful. She acknowledged the group had been researching ancient spiritual practices and that some members had become perhaps overly enthusiastic about implementing their discoveries. When pressed for details, she mentioned that recent meetings had focused on what she called seasonal rites that were traditional in this region generations ago. The breakthrough in Walsh's investigation came from an unexpected source. Miss Laura Simmons, the schoolteacher, approached him 4 days after the disappearance with a collection of drawings Jamie Miller had made during November. The sketches depicted hooded figures gathered around what appeared to be an underground altar with symbols and arrangements that seemed far too sophisticated for a 9-year-old to have invented. Miss Simmons also provided Walsh with essays Catherine had written in the weeks before the disappearance. The compositions dealt with topics such as the wisdom of elder traditions and why contemporary society has forgotten essential truths. The writing was technically proficient but contained concepts and references that seemed to originate from adult sources rather than a 13-year-old's imagination. Armed with evidence that the Heritage Society was involved in activities far more serious than academic research, Sergeant Walsh decided to search the old stone chapel more thoroughly than his initial superficial investigation had permitted. What he discovered would transform the missing persons case into something far more sinister. Walsh's attention was first drawn to architectural inconsistencies he had noticed during his initial search but hadn't considered significant. Certain walls seemed thicker than necessary, and there were spaces in the building's layout that didn't correspond to any visible rooms. When he measured the interior dimensions against the exterior walls, he found discrepancies that suggested hidden spaces. His suspicions were confirmed when he discovered a loose section of paneling in the wall behind the pulpit. The panels had been carefully fitted to blend seamlessly with the surrounding woodwork, but close inspection revealed they could be removed to reveal a passage leading downward into darkness. The passage was narrow and steep, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the chapel foundation. The hidden chamber Walsh found at the bottom of the passage was unlike anything he had ever encountered in his 20 years of police work. The space was roughly oval, approximately 25 feet across, with walls covered in symbols that appeared to be a blend of Christian iconography and much older folk markings. The floor was made of the same ancient stone as the chapel above, but arranged in an intricate pattern that seemed to draw the eye toward a central altar. The altar itself was a substantial slab of dark, river-smoothed stone that clearly predated the Gothic chapel by centuries. Its surface was stained with substances Walsh preferred not to identify, and it was surrounded by candles, dried plants, and other materials that suggested recent use. The air in the chamber was thick with the lingering smell of incense and something else, a coppery odor that turned Walsh's stomach. But it was the personal belongings scattered around the chamber that confirmed his worst fears about the fate of the Miller family. Elizabeth's wedding band lay on the altar alongside David's pocket knife, Catherine's school pendant, and Jamie's favorite carved wooden bird. The items were arranged deliberately, as if they were offerings rather than simply abandoned possessions. More disturbing than these personal effects were the documents Walsh found throughout the chamber. Handwritten journals, some dating back decades, described rituals and ceremonies conducted in the underground space by successive generations of Blackwood residents. The most recent entries were in Elizabeth's distinctive script and revealed the true nature of the Heritage Society's activities. Elizabeth's journal entries, dating from her initial involvement with the Heritage Society in 1980 through the final entry on November 29, 1982, provided a detailed chronicle of how academic research had gradually transformed into something far more dangerous and fanatical. The early entries showed genuine intellectual curiosity about regional traditions and folklore. But as months passed, the tone became increasingly reverent toward what Elizabeth termed the elder wisdom and the true path. By the spring of 1982, Elizabeth's journal entries revealed the Heritage Society had moved far beyond theoretical study into what they called practical restoration of ancient spiritual practices. The group had convinced itself that mainstream religion had corrupted essential spiritual truths and that recovering older traditions was not just academically intriguing but spiritually necessary for the community's welfare. Elizabeth wrote extensively about rituals the group had begun performing in the hidden chamber, starting with simple seasonal festivals and gradually advancing to more complex ceremonies that she claimed had been practiced in the Appalachians for centuries before organized religion arrived. She described these rituals in loving detail, emphasizing their beauty and spiritual potency while glossing over aspects that might have concerned a more objective observer. The most disturbing entries dealt with what Elizabeth called the reaping ceremony, a rite that she claimed was essential for maintaining the spiritual safeguarding of the community. According to her research, this ceremony required the participation of a complete family unit and could only be performed on specific dates when the veil between worlds was thinnest. Elizabeth's final entries revealed she had convinced herself her family had been selected for a special role in preserving ancient traditions. She wrote about signs and portents that had appeared in recent weeks, suggesting the time had come for the Miller family to fulfill their spiritual duties. The tone of these entries was ecstatic and filled with religious fervor that bordered on madness. But it was the discovery of a second journal concealed beneath loose stones in the chamber floor that provided the most shocking revelations about what had truly happened to the Miller family and countless others before them. The hidden journal was bound in crumbling leather and appeared much older than Elizabeth's records. The handwriting belonged to multiple authors spanning several decades, with entries dating back to the 1940s. What Sergeant Walsh found in these pages would reveal the Blackwood Heritage Society was not a recent deviation but part of a conspiracy that had been operating for nearly 40 years. The earliest entries were written by Reverend Croft's predecessor, Pastor Joseph Ironwood, who had served the old stone chapel from 1938 until his unexplained death in 1955. Pastor Ironwood's initial entries described his discovery of the underground chamber during foundation work and his fascination with the ancient symbols and artifacts he found there. Like Croft after him, Ironwood had been an educated man with interests in archaeology and local history. However, Pastor Ironwood's journal revealed a gradual descent into obsession and ultimately something far darker than academic research. By the mid-1940s, he was writing about communications he believed he was receiving through meditation in the underground chamber. These communications allegedly provided instructions for rituals that would ensure the community's prosperity and protection from external threats. The journal contained detailed descriptions of ceremonies Pastor Ironwood claimed were based on authentic ancient traditions but were clearly his own inventions, influenced by his reading of esoteric literature and his growing psychological instability. The rituals became increasingly elaborate and demanding, requiring specific participants chosen according to criteria that seemed to change based on Ironwood's personal whims and paranoid delusions. By 1948, the journal entries revealed Pastor Ironwood had recruited a small group of followers willing to participate in his ceremonies. The group included many of the same family names that would later be involved in Reverend Croft's Heritage Society, the Blackburns, the Evanses, the Greens, and others. Pastor Ironwood had convinced these families they were part of an ancient lineage, chosen to preserve sacred knowledge. The most horrifying entries described what Pastor Ironwood termed the final offering, ceremonies he claimed would ensure the community's protection but which clearly involved the murder of entire families. The first such ceremony was conducted in November 1950 and involved the Peterson family, who had recently moved to Blackwood from Tennessee. Pastor Ironwood's description of their deaths was clinical and matter-of-fact, as if he were recording a routine religious observance rather than multiple homicides. Walsh's analysis of the journal entries revealed a consistent pattern followed for decades. Every few years, Pastor Ironwood and later Reverend Croft would select a family for what they called spiritual ascension. The selection process was based on criteria seemingly designed to target families who were either new to the community or socially isolated in ways that would make their disappearance less likely to attract outside attention. The Peterson family in 1950 had been followed by the Wallace family in 1953, the Jennings in 1956, and the Fosters in 1959. Each family's disappearance had been carefully orchestrated to appear voluntary. Their possessions would be quietly disposed of, their home would be rented to new tenants, and anyone who asked questions would be told the family had decided to move away or relocate for work. Pastor Ironwood's death in 1955 had temporarily interrupted the pattern, but Reverend Croft's arrival in 1956 had marked the beginning of a new phase. Croft's journal entries, which began appearing in the hidden record in 1958, showed he had discovered Pastor Ironwood's work and initially been appalled. However, over several months, Croft had convinced himself his predecessor's actions had been spiritually justified. Croft's rationalization process was documented in painful detail. He wrote about prayer and meditation sessions in the underground chamber where he claimed to receive divine guidance about continuing Pastor Ironwood's work. He interpreted various coincidences and natural events as signs the murders had indeed protected the community from disasters that would otherwise have befallen it. By 1961, Croft had resumed the pattern of ritualized murder, selecting the Gibson family as his first victims. His journal entries became increasingly detached from reality, filled with elaborate theological justifications for actions that were clearly criminal and insane. The final entries in the hidden journal were written by Reverend Croft himself and dealt specifically with the Miller family. These entries revealed Croft had been grooming Elizabeth for her role in the ceremonies for nearly 2 years. He had recognized her intellectual curiosity and spiritual hunger as qualities that could be manipulated to serve his purposes. Croft's entries described how he had gradually introduced Elizabeth to the more esoteric aspects of the Heritage Society's work, testing her reactions and carefully shaping her beliefs. He wrote approvingly of her intelligence and enthusiasm, noting she had proven to be a remarkably quick study and unusually receptive to the deeper mysteries. Most chilling was Croft's description of how he had convinced Elizabeth that her family had been chosen for a special spiritual role. He had exploited her interest in family history and genealogy to suggest the Millers were descended from an ancient lineage with special spiritual responsibilities. By the autumn of 1982, Croft had determined the time had come for what he termed the ultimate ceremony. His final entry, dated November 29, 1982, was a single sentence: "Tomorrow night, the Millers will complete their journey and join the eternal congregation." The discovery of the hidden chamber and its contents transformed Sergeant Walsh's missing persons investigation into a homicide case. However, When Walsh attempted to pursue charges against Reverend Croft and the other members of the Heritage Society, he encountered obstacles at every turn. The county prosecutor expressed skepticism about evidence that relied so heavily on journals and personal effects found in a hidden chamber. He questioned whether the documents could be authenticated and whether they provided sufficient evidence to prove criminal activity rather than eccentric spiritual practices. The prosecutor also expressed concern about the statute of limitations for any crimes that might have occurred before the Miller disappearance. Most troubling, Walsh discovered that certain influential members of the community were actively working to obstruct his investigation. Dr. Evans and Miss Blackburn both provided Reverend Croft with alibis for the night of November 30th, claiming they had been with him at a Heritage Society meeting that had lasted until well after midnight. Other members of the society closed ranks, refusing to answer questions and in some cases actively intimidating potential witnesses. Miss Bell, who had witnessed the procession on the night of the disappearance, suddenly became reluctant to discuss what she had seen. When Walsh pressed her, she admitted that Miss Blackburn had visited her and suggested it would be unwise to discuss matters she didn't fully understand. Faced with official resistance and community opposition, Walsh was forced to close his investigation without filing charges. The official report listed the Miller family as missing persons, presumed deceased, but provided no explanation for their disappearance. Reverend Croft continued to serve as pastor of the Old Stone Chapel for another 15 years, retiring in 1997 without ever facing legal consequences for his actions. The Heritage Society continued to operate, though its activities became even more secretive following Walsh's investigation. The hidden chamber beneath the chapel was sealed off at Reverend Croft's direction, though Walsh suspected the society continued to access it through other means. The Miller house on Chapel Street remained empty for years. The property eventually passed to distant relatives who had no connection to Blackwood and no interest in occupying the house. It fell into disrepair, its windows boarded up and its garden overgrown with weeds. Local children avoided the property, claiming it was haunted by the family that had vanished so mysteriously. The story of the Miller family became part of Blackwood's folklore, whispered about but seldom discussed openly. Older residents who remembered the family and the subsequent investigation would change the subject when younger people asked questions. The official records of Walsh's investigation were eventually archived and largely forgotten. In 2002, 20 years after the Miller family's disappearance, a team of historians from West Virginia University gained access to the Old Stone Chapel's archives as part of a research project on Appalachian religious history. What they discovered would reopen old wounds and provide new evidence about the true extent of the conspiracy that had claimed the Miller family and so many others. The historians found records that had been deliberately misfiled among routine church documents. These records included financial transactions that suggested the Heritage Society had been far more than a historical study group. There were receipts for large quantities of candles, incense, and other ceremonial supplies. There were also records of payments to various individuals for what were described as special services, though the nature of these services was never specified. Most damning were documents that appeared to be membership lists for the Heritage Society, dating back to its founding in 1979. These lists revealed the organization had included many more members than Reverend Croft had admitted during Walsh's investigation. The names included prominent business owners, local government officials, and even members of law enforcement who had supposedly been investigating the society's activities. The discovery explained why Walsh's investigation had been so thoroughly obstructed and why certain lines of inquiry had led nowhere. The conspiracy had extended far beyond the small group Walsh had identified, encompassing individuals in positions of authority who had actively worked to protect the society and its secrets. The university historians also discovered photographic evidence that confirmed the existence of the hidden chamber Walsh had described in his reports. The photographs showed the chamber in use during what appeared to be ceremonies conducted in the 1970s, years before the Miller family's disappearance. The images depicted robed figures gathered around the stone altar, though their faces were obscured by shadows or hoods. The photographs were of poor quality, but they clearly showed the same symbols and arrangements Walsh had described finding in 1982. The discovery of these photographs provided the first independent confirmation of Walsh's claims about the chamber and its use for ceremonies that had nothing to do with mainstream Christianity. The most significant discovery came from an unexpected source. While examining records in the county courthouse, one of the research assistants found a box of documents that had been misfiled decades earlier. The box contained the complete investigative file from Sergeant Walsh's original investigation, including witness statements, forensic reports, and photographs that had supposedly been lost. The file contained evidence that had never been made public, including statements from witnesses who claimed to have seen the Miller family being taken into the old stone chapel on the night of their disappearance. One witness, whose identity was protected in the documents, claimed to have seen Reverend Croft leading the family into the chapel through a side entrance normally used only by clergy. Another witness reported hearing chanting and what sounded like screams coming from the chapel basement in the early hours of December 1st. Most disturbing was a statement from a third witness who claimed to have seen members of the Heritage Society carrying what appeared to be heavy bundles from the chapel to waiting vehicles later that same night. The witness couldn't identify what was in the bundles but described them as approximately the size and shape of human bodies wrapped in canvas. The rediscovery of Walsh's complete investigative file prompted the county district attorney's office to review the Miller case. However, by 2002, most of the principal suspects were either deceased or too elderly to prosecute. Reverend Croft had died in 1999, taking whatever secrets he still possessed to his grave. Dr. Evans had suffered a stroke in 1995 that left him unable to communicate. Miss Eleanor Blackburn had moved to a nursing home in another state and claimed to have no memory of the events in question. Other members of the Heritage Society had either died or moved away, leaving few people who could be held accountable for crimes that were decades old. The district attorney eventually concluded that while the evidence strongly suggested foul play, there was insufficient proof to bring charges against any living individuals. The case was officially closed for the final time, though the file was preserved in the hope that future developments might someday provide the answers that had eluded investigators for so long. The story of the Miller family and the old stone chapel remains one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in West Virginia history. The official explanation, that the family disappeared voluntarily for reasons unknown, satisfies no one who has examined the evidence. The conspiracy of silence that protected the Heritage Society and its activities for decades succeeded in preventing justice for the victims, but it could not completely erase the truth. The personal effects discovered in the hidden chamber, the journals detailing decades of ritualized murder, and the witness statements describing the family's final hours all point to a terrible conclusion. The Miller family did not simply disappear, they were murdered by people they trusted, in a place they considered sacred, for reasons that defy rational understanding. Their story serves as a chilling reminder that evil often wears the mask of righteousness and that the most dangerous secrets are those kept by people who believe they are doing God's work. The old stone chapel still stands in Blackwood, its moss-covered spire pointing toward the West Virginia sky as it has for more than a century. Sunday services continue as they have for generations, with congregations that include descendants of the families involved in the Heritage Society. The official church history makes no mention of the hidden chamber, the missing families, or the conspiracy that operated for nearly 40 years beneath the guise of religious devotion. But those who know where to look can still find traces of the truth. In the chapel cemetery, weathered headstones mark the graves of families who vanished under mysterious circumstances. The dates on the stones correspond to the years when the Heritage Society was most active, though the inscriptions provide no clue to the terrible fates that befell those commemorated. The Miller family has no such memorial. Their names appear nowhere in the chapel records, and their house on Chapel Street remains empty and decaying. But in the town of Blackwood, their story is never entirely forgotten. On foggy autumn nights, when the chapel bell tolls with its mournful, earthbound sound, older residents still speak in hushed tones about the family that vanished into the darkness, and about the secrets that still lie buried beneath the ancient stones of the old stone chapel. The Miller family's tragic story raises troubling questions about the nature of faith, the abuse of authority, and the lengths to which people will go to protect dangerous secrets. Their disappearance was not an isolated incident but part of a pattern of violence and deception that spanned generations. The conspiracy that claimed their lives involved respected community leaders who used their positions of trust to commit unspeakable acts. The investigation that followed was obstructed at every turn by people who should have been seeking justice. The evidence that could have provided answers was hidden, lost, or deliberately destroyed. And yet, despite all efforts to conceal the truth, fragments of the story have survived. The personal effects in the hidden chamber, the journals detailing the Heritage Society's activities, and the witness statements describing the family's final hours all bear silent testimony to what really happened in Blackwood. The complete truth may never be known, but the evidence that remains tells a story of faith corrupted into fanaticism, of community perverted into conspiracy, and of lives destroyed by secrets that should never have been kept. This concludes our exploration of the Miller family disappearance and the dark secrets of the old stone chapel. The story raises as many questions as it answers, but one thing is clear: some mysteries are never truly solved, and some secrets are never completely buried. The truth may lie hidden for years, for decades, even for centuries, but eventually, it has a way of resurfacing. The question is whether we have the courage to face it when it does.